The thing about the Permian Basin is it doesn't announce itself. You don't drive out there and get hit with some big feeling about the land or the sky or whatever. You just drive until the last gas station gets small in your mirror, and then there's nothing but caliche and pump jacks and the smell of hydrogen sulfide sitting low on the air like something that's been dead a while. 11 years I worked that country. Long enough that the smell stopped registering. Long enough that I stopped noticing when it came back. I took the Occidental job in February, which is my way of saying I took it when I needed to and not when I wanted to. The signing bonus was $42,000. That's not nothing. That's a down payment on a 3-bedroom in Odessa, which is where Cody was going to school, or trying to, at Odessa College. He'd been bouncing between our cousin's couch and a room he rented off some guy he knew from high school, and neither of those situations was stable in the way a 20-year-old trying to finish something actually needs, so I signed the papers and I drove out to the laydown yard off Highway 349, and I started the rotation cycle that would eat the next several months of my life in 2-week chunks. I'm not complaining about that part. The work was hard, and it was loud, and it smelled bad, and I knew all of that going in. 11 years, like I said. You develop a certain relationship with discomfort. You stop fighting it and start just moving through it the way you move through cold water. The rig was a standard rotary setup. Nothing unusual about the equipment or the location. The company's own geological surveys had the formation marked as unremarkable. That word was in the documentation. I saw it myself. Unremarkable. John Martin ran the crew. 32 years in the field, most of it in the Permian, and he had the look that kind of time puts on a man. Thick through the shoulders, face gone ruddy and permanent, hands like something you'd find in a geology exhibit. He was methodical in a way that I respected even when it slowed things down. He logged everything, photographed everything. Had a process for the process, if that makes sense. Some crew chiefs get sloppy after that many years because they've seen it all and nothing surprises them anymore. John wasn't like that. He was careful because he'd seen enough to know careful mattered. Tim Sandoval had been with Occidental 3 years. Quiet guy from El Paso, kept a photo of his daughter taped inside his locker. She was starting kindergarten that week, the week all of this happened. He mentioned it twice in 4 days, which for Tim was practically a speech. Beverly Murphy had 8 years in the Permian and was the kind of person who made you feel steadier just by being in the same space. She didn't say much that wasn't useful. I've worked with a lot of people over the years, and that quality, knowing what's worth saying and what isn't, is rarer than it should be. Sean was the new hire, 22, slight, the kind of build that makes you wonder how he passed the physical. He went by his last name because, he said once, his first name was something his mother had picked out of a baby name book and he'd been embarrassed by it since the 3rd grade. He never told us what it actually was. We didn't push. Sean was fine. He was green, but he wasn't stupid, and he worked hard enough that nobody gave him a hard time about being green. That's the crew. That's who was out there. The 4th day of the rotation was a pull day. We were bringing drill pipe up from a depth the survey had called out as a standard wolf camp formation. Nothing exotic, nothing the company hadn't pulled from 100 times before in that part of the basin. The work is physical and repetitive, and you fall into a rhythm with it. The kind of rhythm where your hands know what to do and your brain goes somewhere else for a while. I was running tongs on the stand side, which put me close to the wellbore when the returns started coming back wrong. Mud returns are supposed to be a certain color. Brown, gray, sometimes reddish depending on the formation. You see enough of them and you stop thinking about it. These were black, not dark brown, not dark gray, and black, and with something on the surface that caught the light in a way I didn't have a word for. Iridescent maybe, but that sounds too pretty for what it actually looked like. It looked wrong. That's the most accurate thing I can say about it. It looked like something that should not have been there. John was at the pipe rack when I noticed it. I didn't say anything right away because I was still deciding if I was actually seeing what I thought I was seeing, or if the sun was hitting the mud pan at a weird angle. Then John came around to the wellbore side and he stopped. Just stopped mid-step and looked at it. "You seeing this?" I said. He didn't answer for a second. He crouched down and looked at the returns coming up, and his face did something I hadn't seen it do before. Not alarm exactly. More like the expression a man gets when something doesn't fit into any category he has available. "Get me the camera," he said. He photographed it from 4 angles, logged it in the field book with the time and the depth and a description that I imagine was as careful and inadequate as anything else you could write about something like that. Then he stood up and looked at the string and said we were going to keep pulling. I filed it the way you file things that don't have an obvious explanation. In the back somewhere, behind everything else, in the place where you put stuff that's probably nothing. John had 32 years and he'd never seen it. I had 11 and I'd never seen it. Probably nothing. That's what I told myself. Sean caught the splash during the pull. A return surge came up faster than expected, and he was standing wrong. Too close. Gloves pushed down at his wrists, the way he always wore them no matter how many times John said something about it. The mud hit his left forearm. He wiped it off with a rag and kept working. Nobody made a big deal about it. You get splashed. That's the job. By the time we broke for the evening, he was quiet in a way that was different from his regular quiet, eating with his head down, not really eating. I noticed it and didn't say anything because I figured he was tired. We were all tired. 4 days into a rotation, the fatigue is real and it doesn't announce itself. It just settles in. He didn't come out of his bunk for breakfast the next morning. Beverly knocked on his door and he answered, and she came back and said he was running a fever. We had a med kit on site. Standard issue, nothing sophisticated. And I took his temperature and it read 103.1. I gave him ibuprofen and water and told him to stay horizontal. John logged it. That was the job. What I didn't log, what I didn't say out loud to anyone, was what I saw when I rolled up his sleeve to check for a rash. The skin on his left forearm where the mud had hit him had gone dark. Not red, not inflamed the way skin goes when something irritates it. Dark. The color of a bruise that's been there 2 weeks, except it had only been hours. And it wasn't a bruise. The shape was wrong, too uniform, covering too much surface area, following the line of where the mud had contacted the skin like it had been painted on. I pulled his sleeve back down. I told him to get some rest. I went outside and stood in the sun for a minute, and then I went back to work because that was what there was to do. I told myself it was probably a reaction. Some kind of chemical sensitivity, something in the returns that had gotten into his skin. Unusual, sure, but the Permian is full of unusual. The basin has been cooking organic material under pressure for 300 million years. You find strange chemistry sometimes. That's all this was. I almost believed it. By the time the sun went down that night, Sean's fever had climbed, and he was talking in a way that didn't track. Not delirious exactly. More like he was answering questions nobody had asked. I sat with him for a while before my own shift rest, and he said something I didn't catch. And I asked him to repeat it, and he turned his head toward me, and his eyes were open and aimed somewhere past my left shoulder. "It was there before the oil," he said. I didn't ask what he meant. I told him to sleep. I went to my bunk and I lay there in the dark and I listened to the rig working and I thought about nothing in particular, which is what I do when I don't want to think about something specific. The arm, the mud, the color of the returns in the pan. Probably nothing. I woke up before my alarm, which I never do. 4:50 in the morning and the bunk above me was empty. Tim had already gone out for his first check, and the only sound was the rig and the wind, and Sean's voice coming through the thin partition between his bunk and mine. Not loud. That's what I remember. He wasn't loud about it. It was the kind of talking you do when you're not really awake, low and continuous. Like he was reciting something he'd memorized a long time ago, and was just running through it again to make sure he still had it right. I lay there for a minute listening, trying to make out words, and most of it was just sound, but some of it wasn't. I got up and knocked on his partition. He didn't stop. I pulled back the curtain and the smell hit me first. Fever sweat, close and sour, the kind that means the body has been working hard at something for a while. Sean was on his back with his eyes half open, the blanket pushed down around his waist, and he was talking to the ceiling. I said his name. He didn't look at me. I sat on the edge of his bunk and I listened, because at that point I figured listening was the only thing I could do. Most of it still didn't track. Something about pressure. Something about layers. Then he said, clear as anything, that it had been waiting before the sediment, before the oil, before anything living had a reason to be out here. I remember thinking, okay, fever talk, that's all this is. I remember thinking it pretty hard, actually, the way you think something when part of you is already arguing back. I checked his temperature again, 104.2. I wrote it down on the back of my hand because I didn't have anything else close. I gave him more water, got maybe half of it into him, and went to find John. John was at the field book, already up, already logging. He didn't look surprised when I told him about the temperature. He wrote it down, asked me what Sean had been saying, and I told him. Fever talk, I said. John nodded once, the way he did when he was filing something away rather than agreeing with it. He said he'd call the Occidental field office when they opened and see about getting Sean transported. I said that sounded right. Neither of us said anything about the arm. That was the thing neither of us was saying. I knew it, and I'm pretty sure John knew it, and we both just kept not saying it, because saying it meant deciding what it meant. And neither of us was ready to do that before sunrise. Day 5 ran the way the Permian runs when it's trying to look ordinary. Pressure checks at 6 and 10 and 2. Pipe count in the morning, which Beverly ran and I assisted, moving down the rack and calling numbers while she marked them. The sky was the usual pale, washed-out blue that West Texas does in late winter, cold enough that your breath showed but not cold enough to be a problem. The rig made the sounds a rig makes. Everything was normal except for the one thing that wasn't. I checked on Sean 3 times that day. Once mid-morning, once after the noon break, once in the late afternoon when I had 20 minutes between pressure checks. The first time he was asleep or something close to it. The second time he was awake and recognized me, which felt like progress until he asked me what day it was, and I told him, and he looked at me like that answer didn't match anything he was working with. The third time he was talking again, low and continuous, and I didn't stay long. The arm was worse. I didn't have to touch it to see that. The dark discoloration had spread maybe 2 inches past where I'd seen it the morning before, still following the same logic, not random, not spreading the way a bruise spreads when you bump something, but deliberate looking, moving up toward the elbow in a shape that had edges too clean to be natural. I pulled his sleeve back down and I told him to keep drinking water, and I went back to work. I didn't tell John about the arm spreading. I don't have a clean explanation for that. I think I'd already decided that John had enough logged, enough photographed, enough written down, and that adding one more thing to the record was going to require me to have a theory about what it meant, and I didn't have one. That's my way of saying I was scared and I was handling it by not handling it. Beverly didn't say much about Sean, but she noticed. Beverly noticed everything, she just didn't comment on most of it. At one point in the afternoon, she came to stand next to me at the gauge panel, and she looked out at the wellbore for a second, and then she said, "You talked to Occidental yet about getting him out of here?" I said John was on it. She nodded and went back to what she was doing. That was the whole conversation. But the fact that she'd brought it up at all, Beverly, who didn't bring things up unless she'd already decided they needed to be brought up, that sat with me. Tim kept working. Tim always kept working. He mentioned his daughter once that afternoon, something about how she'd asked him to bring her back a rock from the job site, a real one from underground if he could get it. He said it with a kind of tired pride. the way fathers do when their kids ask for something specific and strange. I told him that was a good kid. He said, yeah, she was. I've thought about that a lot since. The rock she wanted. I don't know if he ever got it for her. The sun went down around 6, and the temperature dropped fast the way it does out there, and the rig crew settled into the evening rhythm. John sealed the wellbore for the shift at 7:30, standard procedure. Everything by the book. I ate something I couldn't tell you the name of now. Some kind of canned situation Beverly had heated up on the camp stove, and I drank 2 cups of coffee, and I sat at the fold-out table in the equipment trailer, and I looked at the wall. John's field book was on the table. He'd left it open to the current page. I could see his handwriting from where I was sitting. The entry about the mud returns from day 4. The note about Sean's fever, the depth readings. All of it laid out in that careful, blocky print he used. 11 entries in 4 days. Most of them were routine. 2 of them weren't. They sat there in the same handwriting, in the same ink, next to each other in the record like they were the same category of thing. And I guess that was the problem. They weren't the same category, I just didn't have a name for the category they actually belonged to. I checked on Sean one more time before I turned in. He was quiet finally. Still warm when I put a hand on his forehead, but quiet. The arm was under the blanket, and I didn't move the blanket to look at it. I told myself that was because I didn't want to wake him. I went to my bunk and I lay there and I listened to the rig sitting still for the night, which is a different sound than the rig working. Lower, just the mechanical settling of metal in cold air. A sound like the whole structure breathing out. The wellbore was sealed 12 feet from where I was lying. John's photographs were on the camera on the shelf above his bunk. Sean's arm was whatever it was in the dark next door. Tomorrow was day 6. I knew it the way you know something without knowing why. Not a thought exactly. More like a pressure change. Something was different about the rotation now. Something had been different since the mud came up wrong, and whatever it was, it hadn't finished yet. I closed my eyes. I didn't sleep for a long time. Day 6 started the same as the others. That's the part I keep coming back to. Nothing in the air, nothing in the quality of the light, no feeling in my gut that said, pay attention. Just cold and quiet, and the smell of diesel and the rig sitting there waiting to be worked. I was up before the others except for John, who I think slept maybe 4 hours and was already running his morning checks when I pulled on my boots. We didn't talk much. That was normal. John wasn't a morning conversation man under any circumstances, and after 5 days with the mud and Sean and the photographs he'd taken of the returns, he'd gotten even quieter in a way that I understood. Some things you carry better if you don't put them into words first thing in the morning. Beverly had checked on Sean before breakfast. She came back and said he'd eaten half a protein bar and kept it down, which was more than he'd managed the day before. I took that as a good sign. I wanted to take it as a good sign anyway. We started the pull at just after 7. The work was ordinary enough at first. Cold pipe, cold air, the tongs doing what tongs do, the whole mechanical rhythm of it that you stop thinking about after enough years. I was on the stand side again. Beverly was running the floor. Tim was on the cathead. John was moving between the pipe rack and the well bore the way he always did, eyes on everything. Not rushing, just watching the operation, like he was reading a sentence he'd read 10,000 times before. The collar came up at 8:04 by the clock on the equipment trailer wall, which I could see from where I was standing. I know the time because I looked at it when the winch slowed. When the winch slows unexpectedly, you check your gauges and you check your clock, because both of those things go into the log, and John had taught me that early. The collar broke the surface, and I saw it before anyone else did because of where I was positioned, and I want to be honest about what I did, which was nothing. I stood there. I don't know for how long. Long enough that Beverly said my name from across the floor, And when I didn't answer, she came around the pipe stand and looked, and then she went very still too. It was attached to the collar, wrapped into the metal, almost, the way you'd press clay into a mold. That's the closest I can get to describing the physical fact of it. Roughly the shape of a person, but compressed, the way something gets when pressure has been applied to it from every direction over a very long time. Desiccated. The word I reached for then and still reach for now. Like the water had been taken out of it completely, and what was left had been folded, deliberately, into the collar's curve. The face was what stopped me. I've thought about this a lot since, about why that particular detail was the one that got inside me and stayed there. The shape of it wasn't peaceful. That's not quite what I mean. What I mean is that the arrangement of the features, and I'm being careful with that word, arrangement, because it's the right word, looked like a decision someone had made. Like whatever it was had been put that way on purpose. Not by the rock, not by pressure, not by 300 million years of the Permian Basin doing what it does to organic matter, by something that had a reason for doing it. I don't know what it had been. I couldn't tell you. I'm not sure the category exists for what it had been. John came around the rack and looked at it for a long time without saying anything. He didn't touch it. He stood with his hands at his sides and his head tilted slightly, and I watched him do the same thing he'd done with the mud returns on day 4, which was look at it until he'd looked at it enough. Then he went and got the camera. He photographed it from 6 angles. I counted. Then he put the camera down, got a heavy-gauge sample bag from the equipment trailer, the kind we use for core samples when the geology office wants something sent back, and he bagged it, methodical, careful. The same way he'd bag anything else that came up from a well that needed to go to the safety officer. He logged the time in the field book. 8:14. "We'll finish the pull," he said. Nobody argued. That's the thing I've had to sit with. None of us argued. We went back to work. I've asked myself why, and the honest answer is that John Martin had 32 years in the field, and he'd handled it the way he handled everything, which made it feel like a thing that could be handled. If he'd panicked, we'd have panicked. If he'd shut down the operation, we'd have understood why. But he logged it and bagged it and said we'd finish the pull, and so we finished the pull. That's how much authority a man builds up in 32 years, enough that the people around him will keep working in the presence of something they can't name. I moved to the far side of the rig at roughly 11:30 to run the pressure gauges. That was my job. The gauges were on the east-facing side of the platform, away from the well bore, and the work was straightforward. Read the dial, check against the baseline, log the variance, move to the next one. I'd done it 1,000 times. My hands were doing it without me, really. My head was somewhere else. I was thinking about Sean's arm, about the face on the thing from the collar, about the sample bag sitting in the equipment trailer, about whether John had actually gotten through to the Occidental field office, about getting Sean transported out. I was on the 3rd gauge when I heard it. I have said, when people have asked me, that it was close enough to a scream that my body moved before my brain did, and that's accurate, but it's not complete. It wasn't only the sound, it was the quality of the sound. The way it cut off. A scream that stops because the person stopped screaming is one thing. This stopped differently, like something had been interrupted at the source. I was moving before I decided to move. That's the clearest way I can put it. My legs were taking me back around the platform, before the sound had finished registering as a sound, and I remember my boot catching on the edge of a floor plate, and me not going down, just stumbling and catching and keeping going. I found what was on the platform. I am not going to describe it. I've tried in the years since, and the words I reach for either don't fit or they make it sound like something from a movie, something staged and theatrical, and it wasn't that. It was the opposite of that. It was the most real thing I have ever seen, and it has no language that I've found yet. What I can tell you is the concrete facts. John Martin was dead. That was the fact I could hold on to, the one that had edges. John, who had bagged the thing from the collar at 8:14, who had logged the time in the field book in the same handwriting as every other entry, who had said, "We'll finish the pull," and meant it. John was gone. It was just past noon. Beverly was already there when I came around the corner. She was standing back from the platform, not close, and she had her hand pressed flat against the side of the equipment trailer like she needed something solid. Her face was the color of the sky on a January morning. She looked at me when I came around, and I looked at her, and neither of us said anything for a moment. Tim came from the direction of the pipe rack at a half run and stopped when he saw it, and made a sound I have no word for. The three of us stood there. The rig was still running. That's the absurd part, the part that still catches me off guard when I think about it. The rig was still running because nobody had shut it down, and it made its ordinary sounds, the mechanical hum and the low grind of the rotary, completely indifferent to what had happened on the platform 10 feet from it. I looked at Beverly. Beverly looked at me. John was gone. Sean was in his bunk, running a fever. Whatever had come up from the wellbore was in a sample bag in the equipment trailer, and we were 3 people standing in the cold on a rig off Highway 349 with no help on the way because we hadn't called for any yet. That was where we were. Nobody said, "Let's go inside." We just went. Beverly moved first, and I followed, and Tim came in behind us and pulled the door shut. The equipment trailer was maybe 12 feet by 8. Smelled like diesel and burnt coffee, and the particular kind of cold that gets into metal overnight and doesn't leave. John's field book was still on the fold-out table where he'd left it. I didn't look at it directly. Nobody sat down. Tim pushed a stack of pipe fittings against the door. Not because it would stop anything. We all knew that. But because doing something with your hands is better than standing there with nothing to do with them. Beverly found the radio handset on the shelf above the supply locker and held it out to me without saying anything. I took it. My hands were steady, which surprised me. The rest of me wasn't, but my hands were, and I've thought about that since. I raised the Occidental Field Office on the second try. The frequency was already set from John's last contact, which was 2 days ago about Sean's transport. That felt like a different era. Katie Morris picked up. She had the voice of someone who managed emergencies from a desk, calm, professional, already in the mode before I finished identifying myself. I told her we had a situation at the Highway 349 location. I told her John Martin was dead. I told her we had 2 other crew members unaccounted for, which was the cleanest way I could say it, and that there were 3 of us sheltering in the equipment trailer. She asked if we needed medical. I said yes. She said she was calling Midland Memorial and Ector County Dispatch simultaneously and to stay on the line. I stayed on the line. Beverly was watching me from across the trailer. Tim was standing by the door with his hand still resting on the pipe fittings. Katie came back and told me help was 40 minutes out. She said it clearly, the way you say something when you know the number matters and you want it received correctly. I told her I understood. She told me to stay where we were, stay on the radio, and not to go outside. I said we wouldn't. I set the handset down and looked at the other 2. 40 minutes, I said. Beverly nodded once. Tim didn't nod. He was already doing something with his face that I recognized. Not panic, not even fear exactly, but the particular expression of a man running numbers in his head and not liking where they're landing, then running them again, hoping for a different answer. The truck was parked maybe 150 yards from the trailer. I know that distance because I had walked it twice a day for 6 days. It's not far. On an ordinary day, it's nothing. It's a stretch of gravel and packed dirt between 2 points. It takes 2 minutes at a walking pace. Tim knew that distance, too. He knew it better than I did because he was the one who had been doing the early morning checks out and back before most of us were awake. "The truck's right there," he said. I said, "I know where the truck is." 40 minutes is a long time to sit in here. "It's 40 minutes, I said. That's what it is." Tim looked at the door. Not the way you look at a door when you're thinking about what's behind it. The way you look at a door when you've already decided you're going through it, and you're just working out the timing. I knew about his daughter. He'd mentioned her enough that I had the picture clear. Kindergarten starting that week. A kid who wanted a rock from underground. A father who'd been out on rotation when it happened and was carrying that particular weight men carry when the job takes them away from the moments that don't come back. He had a photo of her taped inside his locker. I'd seen it every time he opened the door. Dark hair, gap-toothed smile, the look of a kid who thought her dad hung the moon. That's not the kind of detail that makes a man reckless. I want to be clear about that. Tim wasn't reckless. He was one of the steadiest people I'd worked with in 3 years of working alongside him. But steady and cautious are different things. And Tim's particular steadiness came from a place of believing that action was better than waiting. That you could calculate your way through a problem if you were honest about the variables. He had looked at the variables and arrived at an answer. "I can make it," he said. 150 yards. I'm in the truck. I'm driving out to the road to meet them. They get here faster. "Tim, Ricky, it's right there." "I know it's right there." I was looking at him straight. "I'm telling you not to go." He looked at me. He wasn't dismissing what I was saying. I could see that. He was weighing it, genuinely, the way he weighed everything. He just weighed it differently than I did. Beverly said from the corner, very quiet, "Don't." One word. Beverly didn't waste them. Tim looked at her, then back at me. He said, 40 minutes is a long time." "Then we wait 40 minutes, I said. He picked up his hard hat off the shelf. He put it on. I don't know why. Some muscle memory of getting ready to go outside. The same motion he'd made 100 times before. He adjusted the brim and looked at the door. I said his name again. I said it the way you say something when you know it isn't going to work, but you have to say it anyway, because not saying it is something you'll carry longer than saying it and being ignored. He pushed the pipe fittings aside. He opened the door. The cold came in, and with it the sound of the rig, still running, still indifferent, the low mechanical grind that had been the background of 6 days of my life. "I'll be in the truck," Tim said. "I'll honk twice, so you know." He went. I stood at the door. I didn't follow him, and I have asked myself about that more times than I can count. The answer I come back to is that I knew. Not the specific shape of it, not the details. I didn't know any of that. But something in my chest had already registered what the rig had become in the last 4 hours. And that something told me that the 150 yards between the trailer and the truck was not the same 150 yards Tim had walked every morning of this rotation. I knew that. I stood at the door and I knew it, and I didn't go after him. I watched him cross maybe 40 yards of gravel before I couldn't see him clearly anymore. The light was wrong. Afternoon in January, low and flat, everything the same pale gray. He was moving at a steady pace, not running the way Tim did everything. He did not reach the truck. I know that because I heard it. I won't say what I heard because I don't have the right words, and I'm not sure the right words exist. But I heard it, and I pulled the door shut, and Beverly was behind me, and she put both hands flat against the door from the inside, and I put mine next to hers, and we stood there like that for a moment that I have no measurement for. Then she moved to the side of the door, and I moved to the other side, and neither of us was touching it anymore. The radio crackled. Katie Morris asking for a status check. I picked up the handset. I told her we were still in the trailer. I told her we were down to 2. She asked me to clarify. I told her Tim Sandoval had left the trailer and had not reached the vehicle. There was a pause on her end. Not long. A professional pause, the kind where someone is writing something down and deciding how to respond. She told me to stay where I was. She told me help was still en route, time estimate unchanged. I set the handset down. Beverly was standing with her back against the supply locker, arms crossed, not hugging herself but braced, the posture of someone holding their own structure together from the inside. She was looking at the middle distance, which in a 12x8 trailer is about 4 feet in front of her face. John's field book was still on the table. 11 entries over 6 days, 2 of them things that didn't belong in the category they'd been filed under. The sample bag with whatever came up from the wellbore was somewhere in this trailer. I hadn't moved it and neither had anyone else. I didn't look for it. The rig was still running outside. 40 minutes. That was what we had. That was what was left between us and the sound of tires on gravel, between the trailer and whatever came after the trailer. Beverly looked at me once, and I looked at her and I thought about Tim's daughter's gap-toothed smile taped to the inside of a locker. And I thought about the rock she'd asked him to bring back. Something from underground, if possible. I didn't say any of that. There was nothing to say. We waited. The 40 minutes weren't up yet. I know that because I was still tracking it in the back of my head, the way you track a pressure reading even when you're not looking at the gauge. Just a background count, something to hold on to. We'd been in the trailer maybe 20 minutes, maybe a little more. Katie Morris was still on the other end of the radio if we needed her. Help was still coming. And then Beverly moved. She didn't say anything first. She pushed off from the supply locker and crossed the trailer in 3 steps, which is about all the steps the trailer allows, and she stopped in front of the blowout panel on the east wall. I'd walked past that panel every day for 6 days without thinking much about it. You get familiar with equipment the way you get familiar with anything you see constantly but don't need. You stop seeing it. I saw it now. The emergency blowout system on a rotary rig is not complicated in principle. Seal the wellbore, isolate the formation, stop whatever is coming up from coming up. The panel itself is a row of switches behind a locked cover and a manual hold control, a lever you grip and hold, both hands, sustained pressure, for the duration of the sequence. The sequence on this setup was rated somewhere between 8 and 12 minutes, depending on depth and formation resistance. I knew that because John had walked us through it on day 1, same as he walked every crew through every piece of safety equipment on every job, 32 years of doing it the same way. I had listened and filed it and not thought about it again. I thought about it now. Beverly's hands were on the panel cover. She had her work gloves on. She'd never taken them off. And she was looking at the lock, not at me. Beverly. She looked over her shoulder. Not a long look. The kind of look that's already decided and is only checking to see if you understand. You need to go, she said. I want to be accurate about what happened in the next few seconds because I have gone over it more times than I can count, and I don't want to make it cleaner than it was. I didn't argue right away. I stood there. My brain was running the sequence the same way it ran pressure checks. Read the situation, check against baseline, identify variance, and what it kept returning was the same answer Beverly had already arrived at. The blowout panel needed someone to hold the controls. The controls were inside the trailer. If you were holding the controls, you were not leaving the trailer. That was the math, and it did not have a workaround. There's another way, I said. I didn't have one. I said it anyway. Beverly turned back to the panel. Ricky. She said my name like a period at the end of a sentence, like the sentence had already been spoken and she was just marking where it stopped. I have known Beverly Murphy for 8 years. Not well, the way you know somebody you grew up with or somebody you chose, but the way you know a person you've worked beside in conditions that strip everything down to what's actually there. 8 years in the Permian, rotating in and out of the same crews, different rigs, different locations, same basin. I had seen her work a stuck pipe situation at 2 in the morning without raising her voice. I had seen her correct John once, quietly, on a pressure call, and be right. I had seen her do the kind of thing that doesn't get logged anywhere. hand somebody a cup of coffee when they needed it, notice when something was off before it became a problem, hold a situation steady by just being steady in it. That's not sentiment. That's just what I observed over 8 years, and I trusted what I observed. She was right. That's the thing I have never been able to get around. She was right, and she knew she was right, and she had already done the same math I was doing, and she had gotten to the answer before I did, same as she usually did. I could not override her, not because she outranked me. She didn't, not formally, but because she was right, and I knew she was right, and we both knew I knew it, and there was nothing left to argue from. She got the panel cover open. The lock key was on John's key ring, which was on the table next to the field book. She'd taken it while I was still standing there, not moving, quiet and quick, the way she did everything. "Go," she said. "Straight out and don't stop." My hands were at my sides. I don't know when I'd stopped reaching for something to hold on to. I looked at her back, the set of her shoulders in the flame-resistant coveralls, the way she was already positioning her hands on the hold control like she'd rehearsed it. Maybe she had. Maybe she'd been running that sequence in her head since we'd gotten into the trailer, or since John died, or since the mud came up wrong on day 4. I don't know. I didn't ask. I picked up my hard hat off the shelf. Muscle memory. Same as Tim. I didn't let myself think about Tim. I pushed the pipe fittings away from the door and opened it. Cold air came in hard. Late afternoon cold. The kind that gets into the back of your throat. The rig was still running. I could hear it. That low rotary grind, like it hadn't noticed anything had changed. Like it was just doing what it was built to do. "Beverly," "I know," she said. She didn't turn around. I don't know what I was going to say. I'm not sure it would have been anything useful. I stepped out. The gravel was loud under my boots. I noticed that the way you notice things when your body is moving and your brain is somewhere behind it trying to catch up. The specific crunch of it, the cold through my flannel, the flat gray-white of the afternoon sky sitting low over the basin. I did not look back at the trailer. I had made a decision, or a decision had been made for me, or both of those things were true at the same time, and looking back wasn't going to change the math. I walked past where Tim had been when I lost sight of him. I didn't stop there. I kept my eyes on the access road, and I kept moving. The blowout sequence started behind me. I heard the system engage, a deep mechanical sound like pressure releasing through a controlled valve, and then a second sound underneath it that was not mechanical, that I am not going to describe, and then the controlled valve sound got louder and steadier, and I kept walking. The rig fell behind me. The trailer fell behind me. Beverly was at the panel with both hands on the hold control, and I was walking away from her. And the decision was already made, and it was already irreversible. And I have known that every day since. I walked. The access road went straight out toward Farm to Market 1788, and I followed it because it was there, and because walking was the only instruction I had been given and the only thing I was capable of executing. The basin stretched out flat in every direction, scrub and caliche in the last thin light of a January afternoon going copper at the edges. My boots on the road, my breath. The sound of the rig getting smaller. I didn't look back. I want to say I didn't look back because Beverly told me not to. That's part of it. The other part is that I already knew what I would see if I did, and I have been carrying that picture in my head ever since, whether I turned around or not. I don't know how long I'd been walking before I heard them. A while, I think. Long enough that the copper had gone out of the light, and everything had gone flat and gray. The kind of gray that sits on the Permian in January like it belongs there. My boots were on asphalt by then. I'd come off the access road and onto Farm to Market 1788 without really deciding to. Just followed the gravel until it turned to pavement and kept going. 3 miles, they told me later. I wouldn't have guessed that. I wouldn't have guessed anything. I was just walking because Beverly had told me to go, and I had gone, and walking was the only instruction I still had. The lights came from behind me, red and white strobes cutting across the flat scrub on both sides of the road. I stopped. Not because I decided to stop, but because my legs just quit, the way a machine cuts out when you pull the power. I stood on the shoulder of Farm to Market 1788 with my hard hat still on my head and waited for whatever was coming to get to me. 2 vehicles, an ambulance and a sheriff's unit, running together. They pulled up, and the ambulance stopped first, and the driver's door opened before the engine was all the way off, and a paramedic came around the front of the rig, moving fast and efficient, already reading me from 20 feet out the way they do. Light brown hair, blue eyes, younger than me anyway. He had a trauma kit harness on, and he was already opening a compartment on the side of the ambulance with one hand while he was still walking toward me. "Sir, can you hear me?" I said yes. He put a hand on my arm and steered me toward the back of the ambulance, and I let him do it. His name was Gavin. I know that because he said it. Introduced himself like we were meeting somewhere normal, and I remember thinking that was a strange thing to bother with. The name, given the circumstances. Not a criticism. It was a decent instinct. It just landed sideways in whatever was left of my head at that point. He got me sitting on the back bumper of the rig and started his assessment. Pupils, pulse, the standard run. He asked me if I was injured, and I said I didn't think so, and he looked at me in a way that said he wasn't taking that answer at face value, which was fair. He asked what happened. I said there was a blowout. He asked how many people. I said 4 others on site. He looked up from what he was doing, and I said they were gone. He held that for a second, then went back to work. He tried to start an IV in my right arm. My hands were shaking. Not bad shaking. Not the kind you can see from across the room, but the kind that's in the muscles themselves, a fine, constant tremor that I couldn't stop and couldn't explain and couldn't feel. Until Gavin's hands were on mine and I could feel the difference between steady and not. He got the catheter in on the 3rd try and didn't make anything of it. Just worked around it. I appreciated that. A deputy came around from the sheriff's unit while Gavin was working. She was in Ector County uniform, dark brown hair, green eyes, a notepad already in her hand. She introduced herself as Deputy Stewart. Zoe Stewart. She stood a few feet back, giving Gavin room, and waited. She had a patient quality to her. Not the kind where someone is performing patience, but the kind where they actually have it. She looked at me and waited and didn't fill the silence with anything. Gavin said, "He's going to need transport. You've got a few minutes if you need them." She nodded and stepped closer. "Mr. Clark," she said, "can you tell me what happened out there?" So I told her. There was a blowout. The well lost integrity, and there was an uncontrolled event. The crew chief, John Martin, was killed. The other 3 crew members, Tim Sandoval, Beverly Murphy, and Sean, did not make it out. I was the only one who had walked away from the site. I told her the rig was still on location off Highway 349 and that the well had been sealed using the emergency blowout panel before I left. She wrote all of it down. She asked clarifying questions in a measured way. Time of the initial event, crew positions, whether I had any communication with the field office. I told her about Katie Morris at the Occidental office, the radio contact, the 40-minute window. She wrote that down too. She did not ask me what came up from the wellbore, and I did not tell her. I want to be clear about that. It wasn't panic, and it wasn't confusion, and it wasn't that I hadn't decided. I had decided. Somewhere on that 3-mile walk down Farm to Market 1788 with my boots on the pavement and the light going out of the sky, I had made a choice about what the record was going to contain. The thing from the well bore, what John had bagged, what had come up on the collar at 8:04 in the morning. I understood that if I said it, everything else would dissolve around it. The deaths would become secondary to the claim. John Martin, Tim Sandoval, Beverly Murphy, Sean. They would stop being people who died and start being footnotes to something nobody could verify or believe. I wasn't willing to do that to them. That's my way of saying I made a choice that protected the facts that mattered by leaving out the fact that was true. I have thought about whether that distinction holds up. I'm still thinking about it. Gavin loaded me into the ambulance. Deputy Stewart said she would need to speak with me again when I was stable, and I said that was fine. She stood on the shoulder of Farm to Market 1788 and watched the ambulance pull out, notepad still in her hand. The Texas Railroad Commission filed it as an uncontrolled well event resulting in fatalities. That's the language they use, uncontrolled well event. It sounds like something that can be understood and categorized and put in a drawer, and I suppose that was the point. The investigation went the way those things go. Railroad Commission, OSHA, Occidental's own safety review. I gave statements to all of them. I said the same things I said to Deputy Stewart on the road. Blowout, crew lost, emergency panel sealed the well. I walked out, consistent, every time. Deputy Stewart came back 4 times. That's not unusual for a fatality investigation. They're supposed to revisit, supposed to look for variance, supposed to test the account against itself. She was good at it. She would come in with the same questions phrased differently, or she'd ask about a detail I'd mentioned before and see if I gave it the same weight. I did. Not because I'm a good liar. I'm not, particularly, but because the version I was giving her was mostly true. The facts I stated were accurate. The crew was gone. There was a blowout event. The well was sealed. I had walked out. All of that was real. I had just arranged the frame around it carefully, and I kept the frame the same every time she came back. She never pushed on the gaps. Either she didn't see them or she was waiting. I still don't know which. Cody came down from Odessa about a week after. He drove the 2 hours in his beat-up Civic and showed up at the house I'd bought with the Occidental signing bonus, the house that was supposed to be his stable ground while he finished school. And he looked at me and didn't ask anything for the first day. Just stayed. That's Cody. He's 20 and he's still figuring out most things. But he understood that the first day wasn't for questions. He stayed through October. That's 3 months, give or take. He went to his classes and came back and made food sometimes and watched television in the evenings and gave me something to be present for, which was more than I deserved and more than I'd asked for and exactly what I needed. I didn't talk about the rig. He didn't push. We had an arrangement without ever naming it. What I had living inside that arrangement was the weight of 4 consistent statements and everything they left out. I'd wake up at 3 in the morning and lie in the dark and run it again. John at the pipe rack, Tim with his hard hat adjusted on his head, Beverly's hands on the hold control. Sean murmuring to the ceiling about what had been there before the oil. I'd run it, and I'd get to the part where I walked out the trailer door, and I'd stop. Every time. I couldn't get past the door without the rest of it following. The investigation closed formally. The Railroad Commission report was filed. Uncontrolled well event resulting in fatalities. 4 names in the record. 1 survivor. Everything in its category. 3 weeks into Cody's stay, I was sitting at the kitchen table in the house off Highway 349 money when my phone buzzed on the counter. Unknown number. I picked it up. The photograph loaded slowly, the way images do on a bad connection. I watched it come in from the top down. A room first. White walls, institutional, the kind of lighting that makes everything look slightly wrong. Then a bed. Then a figure sitting upright in it. Sean. His skin was the color of a 2-week bruise from his neck to his forearms. The same dark discoloration I'd pulled his sleeve down over on day 5 and told myself was a chemical sensitivity. His eyes were open. He was looking directly at the camera, not at whoever was holding the camera, at the camera itself, like he knew where the lens was and had aimed at it deliberately. Sean, who was listed among the missing. I sat at that table for a long time. Cody was in the other room. The house was quiet. I looked at the photograph and the photograph looked back. and I understood that the version of events I had given 4 times to Deputy Stewart had just run out of road. I sat at that table until the coffee I'd made an hour earlier was cold, and Cody had gone to bed, and the house had settled into that particular quiet it gets after 10, the kind where you can hear the refrigerator cycle on and off and nothing else. The photograph was still on my phone. I'd set it face down twice and picked it back up twice. Sean's eyes in that image had a quality I couldn't stop returning to. Not frightened, not confused, just aimed, like he knew exactly where he was and exactly who would eventually be looking at him through that lens. I didn't sleep. I lay in the dark for a while, and then I stopped pretending I was going to sleep and sat on the edge of the bed instead. The house was quiet enough that I could hear Cody breathing through the wall. 20 years old, enrolled at Odessa College, living in a house his brother bought with money from a job that had killed 4 people and apparently hadn't killed a 5th. That was the shape of it. That was the shape I'd been avoiding for 3 weeks. I thought about the 4 statements I'd given Deputy Stewart. The Railroad Commission report, the OSHA review, Occidental's own safety file, which I'd signed off on in a conference room in Midland, while a man in a company polo asked me questions in a tone that was gentle in the way that's really just careful. I'd answered all of it the same way. Blowout. Uncontrolled well event. Crew lost. Emergency panel sealed the well. I walked out. Every word of that was true. That was the thing I'd told myself. Every word was true. I'd just decided which true words to use. I went back to the kitchen and looked at the photograph again. Sean's skin from his collarbone down to his forearms, the same dark discoloration I'd pulled his sleeve over on day 5 and filed under chemical sensitivity, because I needed something to file it under. His eyes open and level, and pointed directly at the camera lens with an intention I could not explain, and have not been able to explain since. I put the phone in my jacket pocket and went and stood outside on the small concrete slab that passes for a back porch in this part of Odessa. The air was cold and smelled like caliche dust and the distant chemical sweetness that's just always present in the Permian if you're downwind of anything. I stood there until I was sure of what I already knew I was going to do. I drove to Midland the next morning before Cody was up. Left a note on the counter that said I had an errand and would be back by noon. That's my way of saying I couldn't have that conversation with him, standing there in his hoodie looking at me with those soft, hazel eyes that look exactly like mine except without 11 years of West Texas sun in them. The Midland County Sheriff's Office is on Wall Street, which is a name that has always struck me as wrong for a law enforcement building in the middle of the Permian Basin, but nobody asked me. I parked in the lot and sat in the truck for a few minutes. Not stalling exactly. More like making sure I was still decided I was. The woman at the front desk asked who I needed to see. I told her I was Ricky Clark, that I'd been involved in the Occidental Well incident on Highway 349 in July, and that I needed to speak with whoever was handling it. She looked at her screen, typed something, looked at me again, and asked me to take a seat. I sat for about 15 minutes. The waiting area had plastic chairs and a water cooler that made a gurgling sound every few minutes and a bulletin board with missing persons flyers that I did not look at directly. Deputy Stewart came through the interior door. Same dark brown hair, same green eyes, same measured expression she'd had across from me in 4 previous interviews. She was carrying her notepad already. She looked at me with the particular look of someone who has interviewed a person enough times to notice immediately when that person is presenting differently than they have before. "Mr. Clark," she said. "I need to start over," I said. She held the door open and nodded me through. The room was the same room, small, fluorescent, a table with a water bottle already on it like they'd been expecting someone. She sat across from me and set her notepad down and folded her hands on top of it and waited. That was something I'd noticed about her across all 4 previous interviews. She was genuinely comfortable with silence. She didn't fill it. She let it sit there until you did something with it yourself. I put my phone on the table with the photograph visible. She looked at it without touching it. "That's Sean," I said. "The crew member listed as missing." She looked at the photograph for a moment and then looked at me. "When did you receive this?" "3 weeks ago. Unknown number. Hasn't texted again." She wrote something down. Then she looked back up and waited. "I need to tell you what I left out," I said, "all 4 times. She didn't change her expression. She uncapped her pen and said, "Okay." So I started at the beginning. Not the beginning I'd given her before. The beginning. Day 4. The mud returns coming up black and iridescent in a way that John Martin, 32 years in the field, had never seen and had photographed from 4 angles and logged in the field book before deciding to keep pulling, because that was the job. Sean's arm going dark at the splash site overnight, the discoloration spreading up toward his elbow. By day 5, with edges too clean and deliberate to be any kind of bruise. Sean talking in the dark about something that had been there before the oil, before the sediment, before anything living had a reason to be in West Texas. I told her I'd written it off as fever talk. I told her that was my first mistake. Then day 6. The collar breaking the surface at 8:04 and what was attached to it. I told her what I could tell her, which wasn't everything because I still don't have adequate language for what was on that collar. I told her it was roughly human-shaped and compressed, and that the face had been arranged into something that looked deliberate, and that John had bagged it and logged the time at 8:14 and told us to finish the pull. I told her John was dead by just past noon, and that I'd heard a sound from the platform that moved my body before my brain caught up, and that when I got there I found what I found and have never been able to describe it, and am not going to try now. Stewart was writing steadily. She didn't stop me, didn't react visibly. She just wrote. I told her about the trailer, Tim's argument about the truck being 150 yards away and 40 minutes being a long time to sit still. I told her I'd told him not to go. I told her Beverly had said one word, "Don't," and that Tim had put his hard hat on and gone anyway, and that I'd stood at the open door and watched him cross about 40 yards before I lost him in the flat January light. Then Beverly. I told her about Beverly crossing the trailer to the blowout panel without speaking first. The look she'd given me over her shoulder. Already decided that's the only way I know how to describe it. I told her Beverly had said my name as a terminal statement and told me to go straight out and not stop. I told her I'd picked up my hard hat by muscle memory and moved the pipe fittings away from the door and stood in the doorway and said Beverly's name one more time. I told her what Beverly had said back. "I know," she'd said, without turning around. I told Stewart I'd walked out and kept walking and had not looked back, and that I have carried the weight of that decision every day since July, and that I am not looking for absolution from the Ector County Sheriff's Department. I'm just telling her what happened. Stewart set her pen down briefly, just for a second. Then she picked it back up. "The 4 statements you gave," she said, "the Railroad Commission report, were accurate," I said, "and incomplete." She looked at me in a way that was professional and patient, and also entirely clear about what she was not going to pretend. "You understand what reopening this looks like?" "Yes." "The omissions will be characterized as deliberate." "They were deliberate." She wrote something. Then she looked at the photograph on my phone again. "Do you have any information on the origin of this image? Who sent it, where Sean is, what facility that room belongs to?" "No, I've looked at it enough times to know it's institutional. The lighting, the walls, that's all I've got." She nodded once, the filing away nod, the same one John used to give when something didn't fit available categories but needed to be put somewhere temporarily. I sat back in the plastic chair and looked at the water bottle on the table and thought about Cody at home. Probably up by now, reading my note, maybe making coffee, probably not worrying yet. The house off Highway 349 money. That's what I thought of it as now. Not my house, not Cody's house. The house off Highway 349 money. Like it had a provenance that couldn't be separated from where the money came from and what it had cost to earn it. Stuart reached for her own phone. She looked at me once more before she dialed. A brief look that wasn't quite sympathy and wasn't quite something else. Just acknowledgement, I think, that the thing I'd just done was the thing I should have done 3 weeks ago, and probably knew it. "This is going to take a while," she said. "I know," I said. She dialed. I sat there. Outside the window I could see a strip of West Texas sky, pale and enormous, and entirely indifferent to anything happening beneath it, which is the sky's permanent position on all matters in the Permian Basin. I thought about John photographing the mud returns from 4 angles, Tim adjusting his hard hat by muscle memory before he walked out the door, Beverly's hands on the hold control, gloves still on, Sean's eyes in that photograph aimed directly at the lens like he knew I'd eventually be the one looking back. I'd been carrying 4 names for 3 weeks. I was still carrying them, but I'd stopped pretending I could carry them quietly, and that was something. Not enough, but something. Stuart was talking into her phone. I could hear her describing the situation in the clipped, specific language of someone who has made a lot of calls that mattered. I listened to her and waited, and did not look away from the window. Whatever came next would come from this room, from this table, and this photograph and the words I'd finally used. I didn't know what shape it would take. I didn't know if Sean was alive in any way that word applied, or what had come up from that well bore, or whether the Railroad Commission was equipped to hold what was actually in that field book. I didn't know if anyone was. But I was still talking when she made the second call, and the third, and that's the truest thing I can tell you about that morning. I was still there, still talking. After everything, after John and Tim and Beverly and 3 weeks of silence and 4 statements that were accurate and incomplete and a photograph from an unknown number that had aimed itself directly at me, I was still there. That has to count for something. I've decided it does.